Every year, the cherry blossoms are one of the first bright, colorful dots that show up in the spring landscape. There's something I look forward to very much. There's something so delicate and light about them, and these first few blossoms are one of my favorite subjects for botanical studies. Today I'm going to explore Sakura blossoms in my sketchbook, and I want to show you my process for this step by step. And I'll be sharing my thoughts about a very special small palette, and this is the Schmincke Horadam Water Tank palette. Hello everyone and welcome back. Before we start sketching, I'd like to show you a new palette for today's session, which I have been waiting to try out. And this is the Schmincke Horadam Water Tank palette. And what's unique is this integrated water tank and the little water container. And this palette is designed for travel and outdoor sketching. Let's try this open here, and today I'm going to take it for a test drive in the studio because I want to see how the pigments go together and how its usability is. And for our Sakura sketches we will need some very subtle pinks, few fresh greens, and maybe a little bit of a dark red for the end of where the blossoms meet the stem. So my first impression of this palette is that it's very cute, it's well designed. It also has a rather limited mixing area. This is something I usually don't like. I will probably have to do a lot of cleaning of the mixing area, but we'll see how this goes. And I also noted, I filled this earlier, when the water tank is full, it has considerably more weight than other palettes in a similar size. So if I were to compare this to my standard sketching palette, then it already weighs more in the empty state. But again, I love the overall idea and the design. I think similar configuration and design of this kind of palette has been around from several brands. I think Winsor & Newton brought out this type of palette as a whiskey painter palette a few years ago, and I think you can clearly see where this came from. So I'm very excited to try this out, and let's take another look at the pigments here. So they are from the Schmincke Horadam line, which are their artist quality pigments, and I find the selection for this palette, these are 8 colors, and it's quite balanced and useful for such a limited 8 color palette. So I'd say let's dive into the sketching process and we'll see how this little palette holds up. So I've gone ahead and already sketched a bigger twig to get a feel for the overall shapes and lines, and now I want to take this into a more close-up version of this sketch of these beautiful blossoms. So to start my botanical sketch, I look at the overall shapes and structure of my cherry blossom twig, and you can see that I'm using very light lines to do this. You will be able to see better what I'm doing in a minute or so, but I just want to use very soft light lines that I can erase later, and this is an integral part of the sketch. So I try to break down everything in geometrical shapes, and cherry blossoms have a radial symmetry, so they are round blossoms. They can be described as an ellipse, which sort of has a cone attached to it. And if this doesn't make any sense, just watch very closely what I'm doing here with the geometric shapes. Right now I'm starting with the leaves, so I'm just trying to follow very closely the different shapes that I can see in my photograph. This is always easier when you see it live, when you can take a view from different angles and actually see the shapes that you are describing on your paper. So the leaves have this interesting curved triangular shape, and I'm trying to keep my lines very loose, very light, so that I don't overwhelm those really delicate, soft blossoms, that they have to retain this soft character on paper too. So previously I have defined this elliptical shape that goes around the outer petals, so to speak, and now I can go in and define each petal. So I'm taking a good look at the shape of each petal, try to fit it into this rounded shape. And it all comes out of this small knot that comes out of the twig itself, and I try to keep this to point every petal that I draw to point back at the center here. And again, I'm trying to keep my lines very light, very loose, very spontaneous, so that they look effortless and not too labored. This takes a bit of practice, I'm aware of that, but always try to think of this when you're sketching. And here again, I'm trying to draw everything out of this central point, this middle, this radial symmetry, and then I can attach each petal from there. And I don't worry too much about adding in every small wrinkle and fold. I really try to keep my lines light and fresh so that I don't overwhelm my sketch with heavy line work. And you can always use a little bit of eraser too in this process. Let's do a second one. I think it's always good to reinforce those practice patterns and practice lines. So again, I'm starting with a twig here, and then I'm defining this rounded shape, this ellipse. So the blossom is facing toward us. We can actually see the middle. I wanted to have one version of this where I can actually see the inside. And this means that we have to draw some of the petals facing directly toward us. These would be in the upper area there. And then we have the center with the stamen and all of the reproductive bits of the flower. And again, I'm trying to fill up my elliptical shape here, always thinking about that round shape as I'm drawing in the petals of this beautiful cherry blossom. And the last part that I add is where redefining where the stem attaches to the twig that we can't see in this sketch, but I wanted to give it a little bit more substance. And now it's time to try out our Schmincke palette, finally. So this is a very exciting part of the project. I always love adding watercolor. And I'm starting here with yellow ochre. I want to lay down a warm tone for parts of the leaves and the twig, since these fresh spring greens always have a lot of yellow. And I'm also mixing in some green now. What we have here is, I think they call it permanent olive green. And I'm also using a little bit of their lemon yellow, which is their cool yellow here. And then I'm just very loosely painting in those leaves. So I don't want to spend too much time. I'm leaving lots of highlights, and this adds to the actual freshness and the looseness of the sketch. For the dark red, I'm picking up a bit of sepia and add it to their permanent carmine. So we'll have to talk about this pigment too, because this is what I'll use for the actual petals, the blossom color later. And here I'm trying to match this very bright warm orange that I can see at the base of the leaves, so where the leaves grow out of. And I'm also adding this in a few other places to make the sketch more cohesive. And now I need some space for my pink, because I want to add this beautiful pink for the actual blossoms, the petals. And this is Schmincke Permanent Carmine. This is the pigment number PV19. It is very similar to the PV19 that I usually have in my palette, and it has a little bit more opacity. I have to be really careful to apply it in a rather thin wash, but I'm trying to leave plenty of highlights here too, plenty of white. I want the sketch to breathe and have this delicate and fleeting quality of the blossoms, and I don't want to use too much pigment, especially for those soft petals. So I'm using lots of water to achieve a very light and soft pink here. I've added a bit of contrast with the dark red right in the center of the blossom, and now I'm just picking up some of the green, the permanent green olive, which is a rather cool dark green, at least in comparison to warmer sap greens that you usually have in these palettes. So for the very fresh leaves, I took a little bit of yellow for the first wash, and now I can use it in its sort of natural unmixed state for the cooler bits, for the shadow areas. And again, I'm reinforcing, I'm dropping in a little bit more of this dark red pigment because I really want this area to have lots of contrast, so that the soft pink can really stand out against it. And now I'm using basically the same process for the second blossom here. Again, I'm starting with the yellow ochre, which is pulling this kind of double duty as the warm yellow. And then I'm bit by bit adding in the warm spring green, the lightest green. We don't have as much of it here as in the other blossoms. And just a little bit of the twig and the dark red here. And then I'm ready to rinse out my brush, which goes surprisingly well with this small water container, and then I can add in this light pink. And you can see in the reference, it's a bit hard to see. It's basically a big blob of pink. And what I do in this case is I squint and try to figure out where the lighter and the darker areas are. And I leave highlights for the lighter areas, even though they're pink in my reference, but I just leave those highlights and then paint in those darker areas as with a soft pink. So now I have to let this dry to apply a second wash and just flesh out the volume of this blossom a little bit more. So I'm picking up a slightly darker pink here. I've mixed in just a little bit of sepia and a little bit of I believe this is cadmium red, the warm red here. You have to be very careful with some of the pigments if they are opaque. So I still have a lot of water in my wash. It's still very thin consistency. And I'm trying to add shadow here in the darkest areas. You can see in the top sketch that I did off camera that I had a few problems with those darker reds because they actually turned out too dark, too heavy. And this is what I wanted to avoid in these looser sketches. And a quick word about what I'm doing here. I'm adding back in highlights with an acrylic marker, a white marker, and then I add in those little dark dots with a dark red colored pencil. And this adds contrast to the center of the flower, the focal point. It creates visual interest where I want the viewer to look at. So this is the finished spread, and I had a really fun time with this little palette. I really like how the leaves turned out on the entire page here, on every sketch. I'm still not sure about the top sketch. It's a bit too heavy and dark, but this is exactly what the sketchbook is for, making experiments, trying out stuff, and then seeing if it works or not. And I'm actually really happy with how the two bottom sketches turned out, those beautiful soft Sakura blossoms. Finally, I've played around with the Schmincke palette some more and tried out how much water the water tank actually holds. If you don't fill the small container to the brim, which I would recommend, then you will get 3 fresh refills for it out of the tank, which is not bad. Clear, unmuddied water is always an issue when you're painting on location and when you have such a small tank or container. Though I have to say, I usually have a big water bottle with me anyway when I'm outside. But all in all, this is a really cool, practical little palette. And one aspect that's really nice is that you can put more colors into this palette. So let's watch this really quick as the last part for this video. This is already really well balanced. As I said, 2 yellows, a cool and a warm, then 2 reds, a cool and a warm, 2 blues. It actually has ultramarine finest, which is a pigment that I use all the time. And then it has Prussian blue, which I don't use very often at all. Then 1 green and the ochre and the sepia, which are 2 earth colors. So really balanced palette. If I had to choose spontaneously, I would maybe pick a burnt sienna and a purple of some kind to add in, maybe a cerulean or a cobalt blue if I were to use it for landscapes. But this is really, I think I would also be fine with the Prussian blue and the ultramarine here. And then we have still space for 1 random mystery color maybe, but as I said, I find the palette as it is really quite balanced and useful. So all in all, this was a really fun sketching session, and I can imagine taking this small palette with me on location sketching. Alright everyone, I hope this was an insightful video to you and inspires you to explore the spring blossoms in your neighborhood or whatever other botanical sketching adventure you might find yourself in right now. And if you've used a palette like this before or have a specific favorite mix for leaves or blossoms, then let me know in the comments. Happy sketching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!